What is up, everyone? I am Charlie Shrem, and you are listening and watching Untold Stories. I'm actually chewing a protein bar. You can't even tell. Where twice a week together, we get to dive deep with some of crypto's most influential leaders, OGs, brilliant people in the room, those who understand where we came from, where we're now, where we're going, and how we need to get there to truly understand how this movement is changing the whole fabric of our society. And I really equate this to not just the printing press, but the actual renaissance. My guest today, Joseph Weinberg, you're an early investor in Bitcoin and an early director at CoinSetter until its acquisition by Kraken in 2016. You definitely know your way around crypto. We've been working in Bitcoin together for ever. You're the chairman of Shift, which I became an advisor of Shift back in 2000, I don't even know, 17 maybe. What a crazy long-term project. It's so amazing to see what that has become. And now you have become a one of Bitcoin's or crypto's ambassadors, mayors to the world, meeting heads of state, dealing with the most toughest regulators, trailblazing and being the actual one to attack things like the travel rule, which is some of the biggest impediments that we see potential to our whole industry today. So here to tell us, Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show today, explaining all of this to us.
Absolutely. Good to be here, Charlie. Finally.
I know it's been a long time coming, but I should probably finish chewing this protein bar.
No
Why
worries.
would I take a bite as I'm about to start the show?
In the context, it made sense. But
there's a lot of things I want to talk about. I want to talk about how decentralization is actually a path to it, and using Shift is a good example because you launched that on the years ago to be on that path, realizing that in the beginning it wasn't going to be, and now once mainnet was launched with a federation, including banks and countries themselves, explain to us why you thought Shift would be such a perfect way to explain to all of these countries around the world, all of these people around the world that, hey, you can have a base level where you have privacy, but at the same time, we need to have permissionless cryptocurrency too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think this is, I think a lot of the trials and tribulations of the ecosystem over the last, decade is I think that as time went on over the last few years, we kind of started to recognize that there is a place and time for fully permissionless systems, which I think are obviously the most important piece that brings everything together. But after you get past the base layer questions, where humans connect, where social connectivity actually happens, there are different models that likely are required, right? Things like federated systems, just new ways of building social trust occurs in more places than just, permissionless base layers like Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so conceptually, when you're starting to look at different types of systems, whether it be in identity, whether it be in compliance, these are all the realities of the world. And so, when we looked at this problem set of saying, there's going to come a point in the space where, the two different worlds will start to collide, the decentralized world with the centralized world. How do you build infrastructure that can support, the incoming regulatory realities, the changing institutional requirements that exist? We need systems that can still enable and maintain decentralization and openness and privacy, but that can make the trade-offs successfully. And so that's been the thinking over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and definitely
when is that
today.
Let's talk about when that changed, because you had Bitcoin and you were very, very involved in the early days, and you were very involved in one of the early investors in Ethereum. You used to hang out in Decentral with Anthony DeOrio. The Ethereum was pretty much invented in Toronto, where you're from, Vitalik and everyone, all in these same rooms. And then we are where we are now, right? So you had Bitcoin and Ethereum. If you look at those two evolutions, those were still permissionless blockchains, protocols. And then you look at, I don't want to put number 3 or number 4 on it. And I want to know from you where you think we are and how many eras there are. But then you look at where we are now is with Shift. You have this, from what I understand, this blockchain protocol that's designed to take permissioned and permissionless chains, public and private ecosystems, and then
Yep.
having all the data stored in like a one layer, one level, and then everyone be able to opt in and opt out of, whichever different blockchains they want to
Yep.
be in.
Yeah, and it's kind of saying the idea is to say like we have these permissionless base layers as you're mentioning. I don't think that there's going to become I don't think you have too many more advantages today in building more layer ones. But the reality is like where requirements meet, people, businesses, institutions, those require their own type of rules, their own type of logic, right? And so we can deploy, general purpose frameworks, which is really what Shift is, and these kind of like data attribution or data attestation, frameworks, and then start to build general purpose rules infrastructure. And why is that important? Right?
Ooh, I never
That's
thought about
important.
that. Why
Do you
is
know
it
what I mean?
important?
Yeah, and like why it's important is because you say, listen, I'm a business, I do business with other businesses, maybe on behalf of users. We all have to share some sort of a rule set. Those could be laws. Laws are effectively a form of protocol, right? That's a traditional, world. Regulatory requirements are also rules. And so these are all sets of rules. We're just trying to digitize those and make them work functionally across decentralized systems. And what does that mean? It means permissioning is a part of rule sharing across groups of counterparties, groups of users. And I think that these are the things that become really important when you think about use cases that involve data sharing or identity frameworks, because I have to opt a user into a system. The system has to have a certain set of policies, a certain set of rules. So it's really about, can we deploy general purpose infrastructure, smart contract based infrastructure that can allow us to create those rules and to formulate the counterparty relationships, and doing all of this while minimizing trust, right? Like that's the goal, is how do we eliminate this counterparty trust problem that we have that exists all over the world today?
It seemed like when we just had Bitcoin and we had money, we had one level or one layer of trust, it was fine. And then we had
Yep.
Ethereum, we added a secondary layer on it, and it was fine to do it all on a main chain. But as we're learning with this third wave, I guess, is that we need a lot more layers, a lot more base level infrastructure, and a lot better communication and risk risk onboarding and risk offboarding or risk hedging between different parts of the chain, where more security is needed, where sometimes it's not. And hold whatever, because I need to understand for myself, and I'm standing up because this is really important. So are we at the end of this first layer era? You know what I mean? I'm just getting comfortable with investing in like protocols, platforms, and blockchains, what we call them. Are we moving on from that now?
I think so. And I think that there's a few reasons why this isn't critical, right? Like early adopters, we can work around the primitive, realities that we had in the space. Like my grandma is probably not going to enter into the space and start running multi-sigs, right? Like that's just not going to happen. And so the users are broadening, and therefore the vertical of user groups are changing. And that's where these types of requirements become really important, is these upper layers become really important to change risk models, understand the ways in which we interact with these systems. And that's where these constructive layers start to make a lot of sense. That's also why regulators are coming in, is because of that same reality, right? Regulators are saying, we need you guys to step it up and get, bridge the gap here of where institutions are, where the majority of mom and pops are, and kind of meet people in the middle however we can.
Okay, so traditionally you'd have a government, corporation, regulator would say, okay, we now agree that infrastructure is coming or will be built, or people are going to be using these blockchain cryptocurrency thingies. So we need to now regulate them. And you're coming in and saying, whoa, leave Bitcoin alone, because Bitcoin will be its own thing. But let me talk about the Shift network and why that's where we should build the infrastructure. And okay.
Yeah. And the idea being a fewfold, right? The big problem in compliance and regulation is that they are centralizing functions. So traditionally, think of a financial institution, they centralize compliance, they centralize all these risk, functions. And that's very dangerous to the ecosystem, right? Like if we don't think of like how do we rethink or rebuild these compliance functions on chain, making them more open, maintaining decentralization, then regulators come in and say we're going to force all DAOs or DEXs or wallet providers, in the case of let's say Bitcoin, to now build compliance departments, right? And that like doesn't make sense for how crypto functions. And you basically eliminate the point of decentralization or open systems if I have to build a compliance department in everything. So the question is like, can we do these things on chain? Can we change the way that data is transferred and understood, and the way that like risk systems can be added in, but do that on a layer above and making it as like a defensive strategy against incoming regulations for the ecosystem. That's kind of like the concept, if you will.
I want to like bring a real world, not a real world example, but I want to talk about some of like the social issues that we're grappling with today. Yep. And a good example is like these vaccine type passports, right? So, yep. Or vaccines in general. So you have like on the same, I understand on the same, comb. And you and I have been dealing with our personal experiences with COVID, but pretending that there's just that aside, you look at the problem with not the problem with, but what folks, especially in a lot of people that I talk to, look at is that you have big government telling us what COVID is, what it should be, and how we need to solve it based on big government and based on kind of making decisions for the collective, for everyone and not for the individual. And while though like our government's intentions, especially on the local level, are generally good because there are friends and family, local civil servants, larger there's a lot of extortion, graft, and bullshit and fallacies, and we see the lies coming out. But since the vaccines were created by this in quote unquote private market, if a vaccine maker or if medical technology companies or if even how we looked at coronavirus from a data standpoint from day one, if it was all done on a blockchain, do you think there'd be a lot less hesitancy and a lot easier for governments to actually say you don't have to trust us anymore? Yeah.
And I think there's always a trade-off, right? Like, I think as long as we can get the privacy side of this right, like you have to be able to opt out of systems, right? Like that's like the biggest thing that like we fear is like you just force everyone into this on-chain system that like, you don't have that ability. But I do think that that's largely and that's largely what we're trying to do. And I think a lot of context today is like, we want to make sure that you have opt-ins at just the most basic, like primitive level to say, I can now not trust everyone involved in the system. I know what's issued to me. I know my credentials. I know who's been validating those credentials. You can't take away that validation from me unless I choose to. And I think that's ultimately where we're moving. And I think that it does make things a lot more transparent and fair. Yes. It's really a question of like, who's the one putting down the requirements, right?
Hey guys, I'm Charlie Shrem here in Las Vegas to teach some NFL players about Bitcoin. But I wanted to congratulate our sponsor, Kava, because Circle chose the Kava platform as one of their newest blockchains and protocols they're going to be launching USDC on. Traditionally, USDC has only been on Ethereum and one or two other chains like Tron, but now there's a bunch of other blockchains. The Kava platform is one of them, and you can access all of those super cool DeFi high yield opportunities that are on the Kava platform now with USDC, which we know and love. So check them out at untoldstories.link/Kava. And congratulations, guys. Having Circle choose y'all as the top blockchain for USDC to be launched on is a big freaking deal. I'm going to go teach some football players about Bitcoin. Here's Courtney. I'm out. I kind of look at it now, and you've spent a lot of time in like Peru and Amazon rainforest we've talked about, so you really understand it as well. When you look at the basic like family unit or human interaction, our family unit or a small company, small business of 3 people, a small business partnership, friendships, it works until you start doing things on scale. And when you do things on scale with these units, it's society. It's every facet of society. It's when it comes to like removing trust when you have to trust another person, or humans, especially in groups of 5, will start to look for a centralized leader, and they'll look to your friend groups. We always look at one person as making the plans or whatever. If you look at cryptocurrency, it removed that. And like you said, you brilliantly said it, opt out. What did crypto give us? It gave us a simple ability to opt out of a financial system that you're born into and have to die out to or whatever. It's crazy.
Yeah. And that's like the coolest part.
No, I was going to bring it back to when I was in prison, I was able to like study the black market, study the societies, because there was no external communications outside of these small little societies. Were you able to kind of study societies the same way?
Yeah. And I think that and that's like when I spent quite a few years on and off in the Peruvian Amazon, and I went and I would continuously go back, and I ended up helping and funding a tribe and gave them Bitcoin 2011, 2012. But the thing that had led me there, was just personal exploration, but it was also trying to understand parts unknown. And what I learned from that was probably the most interesting piece is the way in which true social networks work at that type of primitive local level is probably the most interesting thing, right? And that's what leads to social consensus and very much unstructured social consensus. One of the coolest places to witness that is in environments like that, because they don't have the infrastructure that we do, and yet people aggregate and coordinate and they barter and they do these just out of natural grouping. Of course, as you get to scale, that changes.
Why do we fight? If you have a unit of 10, when does that unit decide to go 5-on-5? Where is the breakdown? I want to and that's one thing in crypto. We've not figured out this part. We've not figured out.
I mean, that is true. And that's I don't know, maybe it's just greed, or it's some sort of power positioning that, moves away or just a huge disbelief or some sort of a change, or, like a fork in consensus. But I also think that that's important for stability too, long term, right? If you sometimes as much as forks are at times hostile, whether it's between 5 or 10 people or a system like Bitcoin or anything like that, I think that they're important because again, it's an opt out or a change to consensus that a lot of people agree on. But I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
Recently, there was a lot of regulatory heat on something like Uniswap. So Uniswap is decentralized software, and then you have the centralized front-facing website. But anyone could download the code and run their own version of Uniswap that connects to the same liquidity pools.
Yep.
So Uniswap decided to delist certain tokens, but just on their front-facing website. Anyone can still, there was de facto no change. My question to you is, these regulators are not stupid. Do they look at that as a positive symbolism from our community, or they look at it as a shot across the bow? It's we're going to still do whatever the hell we want, and we know you're stupid.
I think it leans a bit more to the latter. I think that by trying to prove the point is definitely what that accomplishes in saying, oh yeah, we'll change the front ends, but in reality, we can't change anything. That's obviously, what Uniswap or someone equivalent is trying to say. I think the issue is that ends up backfiring because of just the presentation or the way that it's presented. Regulators aren't inherently bad, but they are, stuck between rocks and hard places right now. And a lot of this DeFi stuff requires a re-architecture and regulation. That's the honest truth, is that, we're going to be fitting this ecosystem into an entirely outdated framework, and it's going to come with a lot of issues across everyone. And I think that while the intention is to say we're decentralized, regulators aren't stupid, right? They understand and they can tell what decentralization theater looks like. And I think they're trying to tell everyone, we're not dumb. We know. So it might work in the short term, but I think long term, it doesn't achieve the effect we're looking for. And that's what I worry about a lot today, to be honest.
I
That's
do.
what we're trying to hedge.
And just this morning, actually, just this morning on Bloomberg, there was an article about how the current, Securities and Exchange Commission's chairman he is so knowledgeable in crypto. He taught it for 3 years. He's quoting Satoshi Nakamoto, and then he's talking about how he's going after fraud. So fraudsters in our space that are doing like very, very, very bad stuff. Now at least we know that the regulators have the wherewithal and the education to go after those, while kind of leaving the ones who are, we're just trying to throw shit at the wall to see what sticks. We're trying to build out software with all good intentions. So that's kind of my positive outlook on the legacy of the day.
I no, and I agree with you, right? Like, I think they can recognize teams that are clearly trying to scam people versus, ones that are trying to build good things. But again, probably on the SEC specifically, like, they don't care if you're trying to build good things, if you're looking and acting like a security and trying to pretend like you're not, or you're acting like an exchange and pretending like you're not. Like, they see that, right? But I think we'll come out of it eventually with hopefully more clarity. Be seen, I guess. But
we're seeing. So I saw that Nigeria has an insane amount of Bitcoin volume. Paxful is doing like billions of dollars, and if that's not like a warning shot to a lot of other countries that are being with their monetary policy not fair to their citizens, it's like a scary future. You have the IMF warning against El Salvador legal tender. It's just a crazy world that we live in. Yeah,
I think it's amazing. And we've done work with a lot of governments around the world, including Nigeria, in trying to make sure that, for example, bans aren't the first thing they think about, and making sure that they have sound regulation and policy. But yeah, the growth is, I think the proof in the pudding, which I'm excited about. I mean, it is chaos, but as long as it ends in somewhere where everything's not illegal, I think we win. So
I like that. You can start to see the thread that I'm getting at here in this show, is that I want to understand from you if you think, having lived in small societies and in large societies, you're from, people would say even communist society, Canada, right? And then you're living in a free place. Do you think Bitcoin and crypto in general is helping make our whole society more globalized and tolerant?
Yeah. And I also think that, I've always said this, is Bitcoin just forces an educational shift, right? And it makes people think about the most important fundamental question that I think we have, which is what does value mean to us, right? And what's important by way of that. And I think that alone has created this kind of social awakening, just by asking what is money? All early Bitcoiners always would generally start with that.
Yeah.
What is money to you? The definition is always different to every person. And I think that's incredibly powerful, just to have people even think about that. What is the question? What is money? What is value?
Do we have any historical? Do we have any historical precedent where money wasn't in control of the powers that be at the time? Look at when the Netherlands was seceding from Spain. I think around that time there was a few 100-year period where Netherlands was run by just the businesses and the landowners.
Yep.
I'm curious to see. And I wonder if books were written on how their currency was actually controlled and run.
I'm sure. I don't actually have too much data on that.
Me
but
neither, yeah.
I mean, even in these smaller underdeveloped countries, a lot of bartering is kind of abstracted from the actual national currency, right? And it's obviously not at the same scale, but this still occurs in smaller social environments today.
You
but
have
not
a
country
group
level.
of 10 people that are cut off from society, and they need to trade with each other.
Yep.
What is their trading barter? What is their unit of account?
Yeah, well, and that's the big question, right? It depends. So in the Amazon as an example, right? People live on less than $1 a day. They're trading work, they're trading
whatever they have and whatever they need.
100%, right? And it's everyone agrees to a social consensus that something is worth 3 cans or 3 cups, and we'll work for 2 hours to get a peach or whatever it might be, right? And I think that and like it's also that like in those types of systems too, like there is no rule of law, right? Like there is no police in those systems. They're
Sure.
self-governing, right? And so like even in terms of like, respect and what you do and not do inside of those social systems, both from a self-functioning perspective is also different, right?
Yeah, you
Creates an
don't want to be
interesting paradigm shift.
excommunicated. There's no
Well,
law.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, and like you don't want to steal because that's the the worst thing that you could do in systems like that. And so social consensus, the frameworks kind of change,
Yeah.
but they work. They still function, right? Um,
Where
totally different.
where do we see society like in 30 years from now in a all crypto metaverse world?
I mean,
No, what's your answer?
I mean, like, I think if we can get to a crypto metaverse world at all, I think that'll be interesting. I feel like we're just like going down this really uncomfortable, like regulatory fitting things into worlds and conditions that don't make sense. But I
You're
think
not
if
the
we
first
can get
person to
to
tell me
that,
that.
like, yeah, like I think we're kind of like losing on the regulatory adaptation front in like this digital world is clearly encompassing everything and we're kind of it's like a cloud going over everyone, but like we just can't quite figure it out. I don't know. I don't want to say I'm bearish on the future, but
We're
humans
going to
are
be
have good
definitely going
ingenuity.
through some uncomfortable times, and it could be dozens of years, maybe even hundreds of years
Yeah.
of a societal shift. And
Yeah.
it's positive and scary. What's the travel rule? It seems like to
Yeah.
me over the past year that has been the one fear in across our whole industry. And is it
Yeah.
what government is running that?
Yeah, so no government. So it is a collection. So basically, intergovernmental organizations, the OECD is one on policy, the Financial Action Task Force is effectively another policy organization. So it is ran by 36 to 40 countries. It encompasses about 200 countries. And what they do as these organizations is they try to set a standard, which is really the policy that then gets added into regulations in every country in the world. And so the incentive to make sure all countries follow KYC requirements, which is what the Financial Action Task Force does, is to basically put countries on gray lists or black lists for
Oh,
non-compliance. So you force everyone into like this standardization framework through these intergovernmental
goodbye,
organizations.
opt out. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like within reason, right? And like I get that, like I don't agree with the way that the travel rule was brought down. We kind of had like headwinds to like 3 years ago, like realizing that this would probably be the first thing that they threw on the space. Of course, they did. And like what the travel rule is it actually comes from Swift. It comes from the traditional financial system. And
Oh,
so, yeah. And so like when you think about Swift, I'm moving a wire from me to you, Charlie. I got to type in Charlie Shrem. This is your bank account number. Please bank, send to Charlie's bank account.
yeah.
And so like the travel rule is taking Charlie's identity information, your account number, and then routing payments from myself to you. But the reason why it's there isn't for regulation. It's because in Swift, there's no public addresses and private addresses. There's no way of coordinating Joseph and Charlie without adding this identity information, right? So we use identity information in a traditional financial system to move payments. If that kind of makes sense?
It completely makes sense. And there's no central like clearing like
Ledger.
database ledger. Yeah,
Yeah.
like Swift does.
Yeah. So there's no way of doing this like coordination and discovery that blockchains are designed for. And so they basically said, we're going to take that, even though it makes no sense to how Bitcoin or Ether, works, and we're going to just like throw it on you guys as an industry to require this identity information to now be transmitted with every deposit and withdrawal from every exchange. And now what they're talking about is saying we're going to expand that definition to DeFi, to DAOs. We're going
Oh,
to
wow.
start introducing this like compliance requirements into the decentralized finance and smart contract arena as well. Which is like, this is just totally reconfiguring how the space works today. It
How
changes
would
pretty much everything.
how would Shift how would Shift and some of the other blockchains, how would you guys fix that problem or
Yeah,
make it possible?
so the way that we did this with Shift was to say, like, we have effectively this like data side chain now that can work across any type of protocol, any type of business, any type of public and private address system, if you will, any type of smart contract. So what we do is we say Shift is effectively the discovery and coordination smart contract layer, allows, let's say Binance, who's doing a withdrawal to another user, and let's say that user's on Bitfinex, Binance can now write attestations, these data transactions, into Shift, effectively saying, I'm Binance, I have a user, they're about to do a withdrawal. Who around the world has information on this receiving deposit address? And then let's say Bitfinex says, oh, I actually have information on that address. They actually can use smart contracts to mediate that relationship between each other and coordinate, if that makes sense.
It's like so intermediary banks as well in real time. It's like because all corresponding banks, intermediary banks, clearinghouse banks, corporate treasury bank, it's all of it kind of working. Oh, that's very cool.
Exactly. And then it allows them to basically communicate, determine their rules, requirements, jurisdictional, needs, privacy requirements. It allows users to opt into that in GDPR for privacy reasons. And then it starts to build this really interesting system upon it as we kind of start coordinating through this decentralized ledger.
And how did you keep it decentralized?
Yeah, so basically those smart contracts operate across multiple networks simultaneously. So Shift as a federated system, which was a design that was taken from the Liquid network and RSK as kind of these like mediated distributed systems.
You use the roots of Bitcoin for this too. Yeah,
exactly. So we're working on writing proofs into Bitcoin. Those proofs work across Ethereum as well and other chains. And so those chains keep the federation honest. And then these transactions or these data attestations occur on Shift. They occur on Ethereum for DeFi projects. And so they can work, cross networks as a way to make sure we have this kind of business coordination compliance layer for everyone that isn't forcing layer ones into compliance requirements. So that's kind of the approach, if you will.
I love it. I love it. And I know, and so like the fact of the matter is, if we have infrastructure being able to be built off of that, where you have the federation not putting its own will in front of the integrity of the system itself. So if a country who's part of the federation comes along and says, hey, we want to blacklist this or do something like that, or do something that's not with the integrity of the system itself, or not through within the rules, like the mediation rules of the protocol or the system, then the whole system breaks. So it keeps everyone like, I love it. And you understand honest. That honest. It's incentivizing honesty. It brings it back to its root. It's beautiful. I love it.
Absolutely. And then it works across everyone. So we're noticing financial institutions say, listen, compliance lets us play into the ecosystem, right? And so the travel rule is good, not for our crypto space only, but for expanding the adoption rate. Because now we say we've solved compliance, financial institutions can play, right? They can start working with other parties inside of the ecosystem. And that like kind of trend we're noticing across the board too. So DeFi as well, institutionally and other use cases. So
Joe, thank you so much for taking the time today and coming on Untold Stories and giving us so much in such a short amount of time, so much like long-term life bullishness or bearishness, how you kind of look at it. But I think bullishness, we're moving to a more digital metaverse society and building the infrastructure to keep us free, right? Like no one's going to protect our freedoms and liberties except ourselves. I go to sleep at night knowing that the technology is allowing us to do so. Thanks to Satoshi and a lot of the early people and stuff like that. So thanks to you and stay healthy and
thank you.
And I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great, Charlie. Thanks for having me.